I'm Emeritus Professor at the University of Essex, which you see on your screen from the Department of Government, which has been a leading institution in bringing European political scientists and social scientists together. From 1968, it's run an international statistical summer school, mainly for Europeans from across the continent. And it also was spearheaded the founding of an organization called the European Consortium for Political Research, which brought European institutions together after 1990, also in Eastern Europe, and even at one time in Russia. I was second director of the ECPR in the 1970s, currently has about 300 members scattered across Europe. These activities, of course, were independent of the EU, but I have also taught at various universities throughout Europe and was for 3 years professor at the European University Institute in Florence, the EU's social science advanced institute. So I've had a lot of experience informally with European scholars. This has not, fortunately, been affected by Brexit, as the Essex Department spearheaded this development before Britain joined the EU, and it's run independently of it, though sometimes in parallel. Mostly I've done comparative research on democracies, and I've written professional books concerned with this, but I got very much concerned with climate change round about the beginning of the COVID period, really, and spent a lot of time during lockdown in writing a book, which I'll show on the screen, called Kickstarting Government Action Against Climate Change, Effective Political Strategies, which is really a handbook for kicking governments into action. I turned away from purely professional books because of a concern that governments were doing much too little, in fact, practically nothing in the face of climate change, in spite of change getting increasingly irreversible. I think with the natural catastrophes occurring around the world, we're now at the threshold of the tipping point if we haven't actually advanced into it. Human emissions can tip natural processes into reversal. So, for example, forests instead of absorbing carbon dioxide, burn and emit it. The ice caps melt. The sea, which has absorbed so much of greenhouse gases, starts to heat up, and the frozen methane at the bottom will start to gasify and come out into the atmosphere. So I suspect that by the end of the 2020s, that we will have entered a period when human emissions don't count very much anymore, and natural reversals take over. Forest fires, bog fires, sea heating, ice melting, flooding, and so on. So a totally disastrous state of affairs. The problem is that governments are doing very little. Green parties have had little effect, and demos gratify the participants but don't provoke much government action and alienate the population as well. The trouble is governments will almost inevitably put short-term action and short-term problems over climate ones. So for the moment, we've got the energy crisis, food shortage, inflation, and the Ukrainian war, which itself has produced immense increases in emissions. And Brexit itself, one principal effect has been to delay consideration of climate, For 5 years, it took up most of the attention of both the UK and the EU and diverted attention from the promising Paris agreements agreed at the COP before last, which did offer some hope of reducing emissions. But of course, governments then turned to other problems and ignored them or reneged on their commitments. Brexit was, of course, primarily due to the efforts of a faction inside the Conservative Party. Although they claim they had a popular mandate, what the referendum actually showed was that opinion was divided. And other governments than that in a similar situations, like the Irish, have then had another referendum to check the results, which usually has reversed them. Of course, the Conservative pushed for change on the basis of a very tenuous popular vote, and so it is primarily due to the Brexiteers inside the Conservative Party that the withdrawal happened. While the majority of Brexiteers wanted free trade outside the EU, you'll remember the propaganda about global Britain, and primarily wanted an agreement with the US, there was a minority who saw Brexit as an opportunity to get away from restrictive EU regulations, and particularly in the agricultural sector, to free up British action and get away from over-rigid EU policies, both in agriculture and fishing, and got, of course, majority support from farmers and fishers in their own communities. As you probably know, the EU's Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP, was driven by a desire after the war to maximize food production at all costs. So it rewarded production through subsidies and rewards, buying up surplus produce and so on, and promoted moves away from traditional farming, which was more environmentally friendly, and of course speeded up this process in the UK, while also favouring the heavily agricultural economies of the EU, Ireland, France, to some extent, Spain and Portugal, Italy, and so on, Greece. This was largely at the expense of the heavily non-agricultural economies like the UK and Germany. So the CAP really drove some of the processes making for emissions and destroying carbon-absorbing practices. EU, prior to Brexit, did introduce ameliorating measures such as subsidising the practice of leaving fields fallow and paying for this. So it did ameliorate the policy, but CAP's primary focus remained on increasing production at all costs. You'll remember the wine lakes and wheat mountains that were being publicised in the early part of the millennium. But as I said, there was a minority of Brexiteers who saw this as an opportunity to reform British agriculture and develop a more friendly ecological approach in favouring more traditional farming, restoring of some bogland, woods, hedgerows, and so on. And as agricultural secretary in the Johnson governments of 2018 to 22, he was agricultural secretary and encouraged to produce a comprehensive plan for agriculture, which produced mildly favourable pro-ecological measures. Johnson favoured this as it boosted his image as a climate campaigner in advance of the COP conference in Glasgow, and a leading figure in efforts to stop climate change. However, in a manner typical of the Johnson government, He also encouraged a parallel process of getting free trade agreements in line with the majority of Brexiteers. And these free trade agreements made concessions which undermined ecological practices, lowered standards of health and safety and food production. And this went on in parallel to Eustace's agricultural plan, which was finally published, but just before the fall of Johnson, when he was sacked from ensuing Conservative governments, which went over really entirely to an emphasis on free trade agreements, the great goal being an agreement with the US, which would certainly have lowered environmental standards and possibly ruined British agriculture in the process. And also, of course, kept on emphasizing the need for growth and pursuing ecologically damaging policies like high-speed rail. Of course, this emphasis on the short-term economic growth, immediate crisis, can also be said of many European governments, in particular Poland's brown coal mining and electricity generation. So you can't say that the EU collectively was a great deal better than Johnson, but at the level of the Commission, institutions were much more committed to ecologically friendly measures. And in particular, it's currently pursuing a policy of border carbon tariffs. This is a policy to make up the difference between the cost of imported goods not produced according to the standards imposed on domestic producers, environmental, health and safety, and so on, and to put a tariff on such cheap but ecologically damaging imports to bring their price up to a level with domestic produce, which is produced under these standards. As democracies as a whole are the main importers of such products, they obviously have a right to impose their own standards on things such as cheap fashion and so on. So at least the EU collectively is turning towards ecologically favorable practices, though at a very slow pace. And possibly all this is counterbalanced by the war in Ukraine and a determination to pursue it at all costs until Ukraine expands to its former boundaries. So the other effect of Brexit, of course, is for the UK has also been free to abolish EU regulations, which on the whole are environmentally friendly. And you'll remember the recent bill to abolish 500 pieces of EU legislation, including clean bathing beaches, standards for nature in general, and so on, so weakening environmental safeguards. The government has partially withdrawn on this, but still abolished certain of the features. Another effect has been the government's takeover of many of the EU powers in devolved areas of government, so that it has more powers to intervene in Scotland and Wales on matters which were previously devolved to their governments. And it has used these powers in part to scupper some environmental moves by the Scottish government, which you'll remember is a coalition between the SNP and the Scottish Greens, for example, on recycling bottles, very important for the environment, and stirring up opposition to strengthened maritime protected zones. To sum up, therefore, the general effect of Brexit has been to strengthen the hold of neoliberal economic orthodoxy in Britain, opposed to state action in general, and hence to environmental safeguarding and regulation, and wedded to financial orthodoxy at all costs, resulting, for example, in Labour postponing plans for action on the climate emergency because it can't finance it by orthodox methods. And Labour also, one can say, has been very much affected in these terms, seemingly embracing financial orthodoxy to an extent only equaled by the Conservative Party, and really appearing as conservatives light in terms of climate and other matters, rather than pursuing any radical difference in policies. For example, reforming the tax system, perhaps reforming the electoral system, and possibly introducing the only way in which you will get popular support for inconvenient climate measures, which would be to introduce a guaranteed minimum income provision whereby everybody's income was made up to a decent living standard. In that way, farmers and others affected by environmental changes would be safeguarded rather than having special measures taken to compensate them, which are often delayed for many years or don't get through at all. I do wonder what has happened in the Welsh valleys with the severe flooding of 2019 and whether they have got the compensation they were promised. So I think Brexit has had a general effect on British politics. It goes beyond the immediate measures, the tone of discussion, willingness to confront climate change with the necessary emergency measures, and that is probably its most enduring legacy.